Well, good morning. We'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar after a rather lengthy hiatus. This one is on checking progress on your lean journey. And Tim and I frequently talk about this topic, that making progress and getting yourself on your lean journey is easy to start it, but keeping that momentum going and getting the results that you expect along the way can be challenging. And we're going to talk about a few different ways you can go about looking at how you're doing and really assessing what you need to do to get back on track. And just a little bit about myself. I'm Jeff Hajic. I'm the author of What Do You Mean I Gotta Be Lean, a book, and I've also gone over to the blogging world too, and I do a Gotta Go Lean blog. Tim McMahon does the A Lean Journey blog, and if you don't follow him, if you came through this through one of my portals, I recommend following him. He has one feature that I particularly like, and he does almost a daily post on Facebook. It's maybe a sentence or so about something you can do, and he consolidates that on his blog. So if you're looking for these quick little tidbits of lean information, it's probably the best thing I've seen out there in terms of getting like a drip feed of lean content. So I highly recommend that. So Tim, anything else you want to say about yourself?
No, just celebrating the third anniversary of the website today. So.
Oh, really? Well, congratulations.
But this brings us to a good topic, because this is something I think that we're frequently asked, as people in the practicing lean, and the fact that everybody wants to know, how do you know you're lean enough, or how do you know when you got there? So this is something I think that everybody's kind of asked, and we'll be able to hopefully shed some light on that today.
Well, you just made a great point in that, how do you get there? And the first thing that you have to do is you have to define what there is. So when you're checking progress, it doesn't matter how far you've gone if you don't know where you're heading. And if you think about the same thing, if you're talking about a road trip, you can't tell whether you're on track unless you have that road trip. But obviously there is one problem with getting from here to there, right, Tim?
Yeah, it's never a straight path.
Yeah, and this is actually probably less complicated than the real world. So when you look at, how do you get somewhere, you have to choose the route that you're going to take. And it's a lot of obstacles along that path, and there's a lot of barriers. So it's never a straight line. But once you chart that path, you now have something to measure against. And that's really the key to what we're going to be talking about today, is you're measuring not against the destination, but against the expectation of where you should be at any given point in time. And that's what this shows, is if you know you're over here, you're not comparing that to the destination, you're comparing that to where you think you should be along the way. Now, Tim, do you see that happen often, of people measuring kind of incorrectly like that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, certainly if you don't know where you're going, you'll never get there. The car analogy works really well here. So I think, as if you were traveling to a different place, you would map out your route. You might have milestones along the way to kind of benchmark your progress as you go. But certainly if you veer off and you take a wrong direction, if you've got the Garmin going or whatever, then you'll have some sort of auto-correction. And that's really what we want to try to put in place here, is that it'll be some sort of mechanism that'll tell us when we're off track and we need to recalibrate.
Well, that's the other key point here, is that it doesn't matter if you figure out how far off track you are if you don't do anything about it. If you're driving and you get lost, you don't just keep driving in that direction. You get back onto your path. You find the way back on, you get back on the on-ramp. And that's something that people often forget. They want to measure their progress, but they don't do it with the end in mind, and that measuring progress is not the goal. The goal is to get back on track.
Yep, lean is really about visual management, right? So you're looking at where you're going and what your progress is to get there.
Absolutely, but it's not really about being lean, though, right? You're really talking about, in what we're talking about, is the big picture. And Tim, what really matters for a business?
I think that comes down to each individual business, and I think that's why, when it comes down to the fact when we look at lean, it's always about customer satisfaction and growing the business. Anything less than that is kind of self-fulfilling. So, but that's the important part, is to start at where you are now and where you want to be, and kind of map that out.
Well, yeah, like you mentioned, like customers and growing the business, and all those things are really the top level metrics. If you think about what do investors care about, what do owners care about, taking care of the customers, those are all like what I kind of consider the second tier standard metrics. They're the big ones are like sales, profit margin. That's what it really comes down to. All the taking care of customers is about making a business generate money for the owners. If you're not out to make money in a business, it's really a nonprofit organization. But there's a lot of good ways to make money, and those are the things you're talking about. The customer service, quality, lead time, satisfaction, and it gets even more complicated because industries each have their own particular challenges. The banking industry has a much lower profit margin than high technology. When you do a lot of investment into the R&D, or you can charge a much higher price because you've created almost a monopoly on that piece of technology. So margins are very different, and then there's a lot of different ways to look at the business. So there's not a universal number for each business. That's another thing that's very challenging as people move into this idea of trying to measure their lean progress. Each industry has a difference, and then there's also the issue of everybody wants to compare themselves to Toyota, but not everybody has been on the path for that long. Toyota's been on it for like 40 or 50 years. So, do you see that as a problem, Tim, with this benchmarking the best and not an incremental companies along the way?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of benchmarking from the standpoint of judging your the status of your business individually. I mean, I think benchmarking is a valuable tool to use to help you learn about what other things are out there that other businesses are doing that you can maybe apply to your market segment. But to just compare, one type of business A to business B, I'm not a big fan of that because I think that can steer you off of where you want to go, and you end up just copying somebody else's system.
I think it's also very discouraging is if you pick somebody who's great at something and you fall short. It can be a big setback if you set your bar too high and people continually fail to meet that goal. So as you start selecting your progress and starting to get your ideas about what it is you want to do, it has to be something that keeps people engaged and keeps them moving forward. And the way to do that internally, there's two main tools that are used to turn those big picture goals into something your company can use. And Tim, you want to talk about these two tools?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, these tools, again, are, what's commonly used in Lean is to make things visual and to filter, right? So you'll see that this, the one on the left is an A3 or Ocean Connery type analysis, and we call it the X matrix because of the X in there. But it looks at longer-term goals, relates them to year-long goals, and then looks at tactical measures that you can take, and then improvement measures related to those tactical items. And then you're able to assign responsibilities to those. So it puts all the information you want in one place, but because you're kind of limited to the size, it does have to filter out, and I think it's an important part to recognize that you need to work on the vital few. You only have a limited number of resources. As many or as few people as you always have limited resources. So you do have to work on the vital few. And then the other one is what we call a bowling chart, and that's kind of like the bowling lanes, and that's how it gets its name. But you're able to look at those key measurables and track your progress both from a year-to-date standpoint and maybe a monthly snapshot. And it kind of gives you a visual picture, and you can color code those, red, green, yellow, to give you a quick status of where you're at. And maybe you don't talk about the ones you're on track on. You maybe just dive into the ones that you're behind on and look at them, what countermeasures you're going to put in place to get back on track.
Right, and what these do is these take that roadmap you have, and it gives you a frame of reference when you're checking your progress. Now, both of these things aren't necessarily lean type of metrics, that you can put any type of metrics, business metrics on it that you want. And I want to keep coming back to that point, is measuring your lean progress is not as important as measuring your overall progress. And we'll get to like specific lean functions as how they relate to that. So we'll talk a little bit about how to look at the specific lean activities versus overall business metrics and measuring your progress. So these are all metrics that you see regularly in an organization, and these are all closely associated with lean.
So Jeff, can you measure too many items?
Well, yeah, why don't you talk about that? I think you have a good idea there. I think I'll let you dive into that.
Again, I think, when you want to look at metrics for your business, the more things you track, the more time-consuming it obviously is. So there is, like in all things lean, an optimum number that you need to run your business, and that will be different for every business or industry segment. But certainly it isn't about just capturing more metrics. It's looking at which ones really apply to your business. And then maybe out of those, if you have some that you're behind on, maybe you have some subsets for a specific time period to help you get back on track on something that you're behind on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you track it forever.
Yeah, and there's a lot to that is you create countermeasures, and countermeasures drive these temporary metrics that you put in place. And now the interesting thing in here is all of these things are related to processes. So as you look at these, everything here, talk about productivity, you're talking about the processes behind it. Lead time, you're talking about the processes to get things out the door. And even with these, you can see how some of these cascade down. The response time for andons plays a role in productivity and quality. The percent of parts, AB parts on Kanban would have a role on your inventory turns, possibly. So there's certain things that cascade up. But the important thing about looking at these from a lean perspective, imagine you have two companies, and you take a point in time and you measure where they are. If you look at these companies in isolation, which one looks better? Oh, I'm handing it off here, Tim. I was just.
Oh, yeah, certainly you would think A looks better, but you have no bearing for that.
Right, and that's what this is. We're a little off our game, I think. I was just trying to feed you in here. I've been talking a lot of trying to make sure we balance it out, but I want to hear, just to give the people a chance to hear your ideas too. What's this represent here?
Well, I think, this is something common we always face when you publish metrics, is knowing what the goal is, what your trend is. I think it's important to highlight those, where you've been as well as where you need to get. So it's important when you publish metrics that you look at those kind of things, and that it's clearly understandable to everybody in the company. But I think you raise a good point here in the fact that we need to manage the process, not necessarily the end result. That's just an effect of the process itself. So again, we want to look at how we're performing the process, not just the number at the end, whether it's scrap. You don't want to just look at the dollar number at the end, but the means in which you're tracking your scrap and analysis of that process.
And that's really the core of where we're going to move now, what you just said. And the slope of those arrows really comes from the effectiveness of your lean training, the degree of your lean participation in your organization. So the more people you have engaged, the more people you have focusing on problem solving, the more people that participate in Kaizens, presumably you would have a steeper slope on your improvement lines, right?
Right.
But these are all the kind of metrics you see occasionally, right? And now there are some drawbacks to measuring things like this. They can be easily pencil whipped, and there's a general lean argument when you talk to people. There's really two camps. And the first camp says, well, these measures don't necessarily result in an actual improvement. So just making somebody sit in on training doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get good results. And the other camp, of course, says, well, if you don't have people sit in on training, you're probably not going to get any results at all. So do you ever see this kind of as a heated debate, Tim?
Yeah, I call these kind of squishy metrics, things that you can manipulate. But my take on this is that if you weren't measuring these things, would you necessarily drive improvement with them? So in my role, I've always tracked these things. I had a company once that wanted to do 12 Kaizens a year. And, so it's one a month. It's pretty easy. They weren't able to accomplish that. the following year they decided that part of their short-term incentive plan would be to do 12 Kaizens a year. So again, they had the same measurement goal, but now they tied some sort of reward to it. They made all 12 that year. So I think it's important that you kind of look at it and say, if it will help you drive the results that you want, then track it. If it won't, then it's probably not worthwhile.
And one of the challenges is, companies that are really great at lean, they have this already built into their culture. So they don't have to track the number of Kaizen events because it's a go-to solution. So if you have very aggressive goals and you've already built this, you've kind of woven your Kaizen mindset into the fabric of your organization, it's a solution. It's part of the tools in your toolkit. But if you're not at that point yet, you run into problems. So what I recommend is I tell people, generally I use this as a second layer of measure. It's something that I don't ever look at as a permanent metric, but it's a countermeasure. So if you see that the slope in that previous slide, if it's not steep enough for your taste, you go back and you say why. And like Tim was saying, that's what his company did. They didn't see enough Kaizen activity. There wasn't enough focus on it. So they went and did that. And presumably what would happen, once they kind of realize the gains from Kaizen, they get comfortable with it, it becomes something that's not an aberration, an outside the job thing, they'll start doing it more. And then you don't have to measure it anymore once people start, working with that as part of the way they operate.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. You don't have to track every metric forever, and certainly along your journey, the types of metrics you might look at is different.
Right. But one that really is important to take a look at is leadership. And Tim talks a lot about leadership, and he's in a big role right now. He's been in 2 companies in the last 6 months where he's really having to push Kaizen. So he's one of these core leaders. So why don't you talk about these ideas here, Tim?
Yeah, I think for me, leadership, it always comes back to, because they're kind of they set the plan, do, check, act for the business. I think you got to keep in mind that that's really the goal of management, is to create those that cycle. Set the vision, how you're going to accomplish that, align the resources to do it, and then you have to verify that you've actually done some of the improvements that you need to, or you met the goals of the business unit or the company. And then if not, you have the adjustment cycle, the countermeasures. So we talk a lot about that, both on both of our websites, because this is a really important lever to being successful.
Well, and one of the big things here is that it's really about whether leaders are, there's an old expression, walking the talk. And leaders go out and they tell their teams to 5S their work areas, and you walk into the leader's office and there's piles of stuff all over the desk. Or you push standard work for a production area as a manager, and you don't have any structure to how you operate. So these things are the disconnects, and really comes down to our leaders doing what they say the team should do. Are they doing it themselves? Another big one is there a leadership presence consistently? And there's the old story about the chalk circle. You want to tell about the chalk circle?
Oh, standing in the chalk circle.
Oh, yeah.
Ono would stand there and watch the processes. That's the participation part. I think people follow by example. Sometimes you do have to do something extraordinary like that and make a point. And that's where leadership comes in. People want to follow somebody. You have to be out front there and show them the right example.
Now a lot of the leadership things, though, they seem less like something you measure continuously and more like has this happened? Like when you talk about policy deployment, it's kind of difficult to measure. Once you have policy deployment in place, you're measuring. It really is a measurement system in itself, so you can kind of see whether it's effective or not as you go. But I use these as mostly litmus tests. The Gemba one, I don't know if it's necessary to measure how many minutes a day a leader is down in the work area, but you could probably go about measuring that somehow. What's the a perception of the team members. If when's the last time you talked to your leader? There's ways to look at that. But the other ones all seem like they're more, do you do this or do you not do this? So as you start to put together some kind of assessment to gauge your progress, the leadership one really is once you cross that threshold, it's hard to go back in these things. So once you start using policy deployment, you very seldom see people discontinue its use. And once you put daily management systems up on the wall and you start tracking regularly, those things don't tend to disappear. So that's kind of the leadership thing. Leadership tends to be, I mean, do you kind of understand what I'm saying? Once you cross that threshold of a leadership style, you don't generally slide backwards into a worse leadership style. Do you see that, or am I?
Yeah, no, true. And I think people forget that management is a process just like any other in the business, and it should be managed the same way as you would a production or service-related project or process. Going to the gum is a good example, related to what we talked about, and the fact that if you wanted to change your company's culture and require managers and frontline people to spend time in the area, maybe that is a measure you put in place for some time period and say, you have to spend 1 hour a week in your process and then report back what you see and what opportunities for improvement, not just spend an hour out there, but what else, more to that. But, maybe if that's already part of your culture, then that's obviously something you don't have to do.
Exactly. Now this is not a real smooth transition here, but, Kaizen is a big part of Lean. And, Kaizen does not equal Lean, but if you're doing Lean, you're going to have Kaizen projects. When I talk about Kaizen here, I'm talking about the Kaizen project, the Kaizen events, or the Blitz, or the Continuous Improvement Workshop. There's a lot of different names. But these are the week-long focused events. And generally to measure those, you see an audit form, some kind of audit that you go back after the fact and you look and say, have you completed things that you said you were going to? Are you hitting your targets? So, you have both the process type of things. Are you closing out the action items? Is the communication plan done? Those types of things. And then there's also the metrics. Did it accomplish its goals? And go ahead.
No, I think it's important to note here that this really gets to sustaining, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how committed is the management team? How committed are the employees? And then how well can you sustain? And change does take some time, so you maybe want to look. They have the 3-week rule, kind of look out after 3 weeks to see where you're at. But generally in Kaizen's coming out, you have some sort of 30, 60, 90-day follow-up possibly. And one thing I would add here is that, use the 80-20 rule. You're never going to get 100%. Get the majority, accomplished, and because you're going to come back, that's the whole point of continuous improvement, and make, future updates to your process.
Well, I also think this is a great opportunity for tracking your systems. The way people follow up on Kaizen is an indicator about cultural feelings in the organization. So if the Kaizen is done and people drift back to their jobs and there's no overlap in how they spend their days, if their days is either production or either, they have to be a special occasion to make an improvement, it's a big tell. And it's like you said about the commitment and sustaining. And to sustain these gains, you have to be committed to doing them over and over and over. And you can't look at Kaizen activity as a secondary function. And doing these audits and tracking the results of the audits on a big more of a macro layer. Are audits completed on time? Are they done effectively? Those kinds of things is a good way of tracking your Lean progress. Do you do what you say you're going to do effectively?
Yeah, Kaizen isn't a project, right? It's a countermeasure to another solution. So.
Right, that goes back to that whole big picture thing, is once you set your big picture goals, Kaizen becomes a tool to reach those goals. And the tool is only effective if you build a culture around that, right?
Yep.
So, there's I'll get down to this one here, and you've read Toyota Kata, right?
Yeah, very good book. I recommend it for everybody.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
So, Toyota Kata really gets at the, he's got the pictorial there, the dance steps that you take. Really, it's, the Kata is Japanese for the martial arts dance steps, right? So, it's more about the way you do things, the approach, the behavior, how the management team interacts. And I think, this is an important place you want to get to. And there is a process in which you build to get there, and I think we talked a little bit about those steps today, but I highly recommend following up and reading that. It's really enlightening.
Well, and how would we go about measuring some of these behaviors? How do you measure a culture? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's always a question. I come down to the process. I think if you see general improvement, I'm okay with that. But to measure each little step, how you engage employees or how active is the management participation, those are kind of squishy metrics. If they help you get where you want to go, fine. But, I don't think it's something you're going to track long term either. So.
Yeah, this is one of those things where it becomes a challenge. And I look at it as, I think Tim talked about this before. He talks a lot about countermeasures. When you listen to how he talks, his style of thinking is very similar to a lot of the lean greats. And he always thinks in terms of PDCA. You think through the cycle of what are you going to do to make the improvement, how do you measure it. So when he talks about countermeasures, what I think he's saying is if you don't have a problem at cross-training, it's not worth measuring. But I look at it as if you do have a problem when a person is absent, that you're so focused on your lean organization, you've got things very, very fast. Sometimes it's hard to step into a very fast-paced organization and do a good job. So if absenteeism is killing your productivity, you might want to measure something about cross-training. You put up a cross-training matrix and you challenge your team to be able to do several different jobs. So like Tim's saying, it's a response to a particular problem. So if your problem is that you feel like you're not making a lot of progress in lean initially, you might choose a few of these to try to measure. If your problem is more specific, like I said, about absenteeism, or that people aren't adding to their tool set, you might focus on mentoring. But a big one I do like to look at, if there's not a lot of progress, I like to look at how well is the organization staffed for projects. So when a team is required to make solving problems part of their job, but there's no time allocated for that, there's a big disconnect in that leadership. So that is something that I do look at measuring. And this goes back to the whole idea of, are you measuring some of the lean activities? Because that's really a function of how much time you're allocating, right?
And I think it comes back to walking the talk, right? If you want people to improve, but you don't allow them to either time, money, or availability, you're never going to get that improvement. There's one other on this list I would highlight too, and the fact is turnover. I think that's a measure of the success of your business. How well are you in respect for people, investing in people. And this is certainly one of those silent killers for organizations. It's not a short-term issue, but long-term, significant turnover can really hamper a business to be able to grow because you lose so much knowledge that you poured into the people, which are the heart and soul of the company. So that's really one I think every company should look at.
Well, have you been in a company that's started a lean journey, or have you been in companies that have been somewhere along the way?
Both.
Well, what do you see as far as turnover when an organization first becomes lean? Because a lot of our listeners and a lot of people who will be watching this later on YouTube are brand new to lean, and they're looking for ways to assess progress. So what would they expect to see as far as turnover from a company that's not lean until it becomes further down that lean journey? What would you expect?
And let me preface this by saying you shouldn't have zero turnover. If you never had somebody new enter the business, you'd never bring new ideas or new skill sets. Possibly you need a new skill set for a new problem. So it's not that you want the turnover zero, but a very high turnover rate is some indication, at least that the management is not being effective. And I think when you start a lean journey, you will certainly have people that can't accept the change. They don't like that, and some of those people will leave the organization, and that's not necessarily bad. But there are certainly people that you want to retain and you want to invest in, and they may not see the light at the beginning either, but you don't necessarily want to lose them. They can be some of your biggest advocates. Initially, it can be some of your biggest roadblocks. So I think it's real important to keep track of that number, whether there's an optimal number, something different, but it's still important to look at. And I think that's something you look at over a longer period of time.
Well, this might be a little bit of a rat hole to dive into for a couple minutes. There's a lot of talk from, it's almost like a political correctness talk about the abilities people have. Everybody's got, I'm trying to frame my thoughts here, but not everybody can do every job. And not everybody has the right mentality to go into a lean organization. And then there's also the desire of some people don't want to work the way you're working in a lean organization. Now, I've heard the term work smarter, not harder, but I think it's actually, in a lean organization, you're required to work smarter and harder. And I think it's kind of a myth that in a lean organization you're not working, you make it easier. It's not exactly true. The tasks become easier, but there's a higher expectation on people. They're pushed out of their comfort zone. They're asked to pull a lot of the waste out, and often waste is comforting because you can stand there watching a machine run for 5 minutes and get a little break. But as you take that waste out and you start working more consistently throughout the day, your job might get a little bit more demanding in lean. So there's some of that goes into it, and some people don't like that. And there's this definite balance you have to strike as you start thinking about how do you manage relationships with people as a manager and start measuring the turnover, because people will self-select, as you said. Some people won't like it, and they'll say, I don't like this anymore. This isn't the job I signed up for. I'm leaving. And sometimes you'll have to move people out. And there's also this function of changing people's roles within the organization. Often you'll have a person who can't handle the job they're in, but they're still great at other things, and you can move them. And that can be difficult for people too. So there's this big chaos that comes sometimes in terms of lean changes the rules of the game, and you have to recalibrate all the people on the team to fit into these new rules that you're creating. And it is something that is a cultural, it creates this chaotic organization for a brief period of time.
Yeah, and I think these are things that you touch in your book, Gotta Go Lean. So, I mean, I would take a look at that as well, but certainly not everything stays the same. That's the whole point of the change. The roles change. You bring in new elements, you ask people to do different things, but in the end, I think people find it more rewarding. The business is more successful, there's more opportunities, and certainly, obviously we advocate this kind of approach because we've seen it work.
Mm. Well, what it comes down to is winning is fun. I had an old boss who used to say that, winning is fun. And once you start on that path and you start making all this progress, it's a lot of fun to be on a winning team. And the people that are left after some of this chaos and change, it's not to say you should have a complete overhaul and turnover of your whole staff, but like you said, you should not have zero. There is going to be some people leaving of their own accord. So anyway, probably enough on that. Next thing to talk about is infrastructure. So culture is one part of the change, but the culture still requires stuff. You have to have things available to make changes, and hopefully your workshop was a little bit more modern than this old blacksmith shop. But you do want a place to go out and create. And a blacksmith, I use this picture because there's some standard things that they do. They make horseshoes, they make a certain amount of tooling, but a blacksmith has the tools to do whatever they want, right?
Yep.
And as you get into that, you want to create an area where people can work. So do you have any areas like that in your organization, Tim?
Yeah, we do. I mean, I think when it comes to infrastructure, this is management's responsibility, right? You got to manage the career path and development of teams and provide the resources. So if you don't have this in your workplace, this might be somewhere, if you're a manager, you want to create it. If you're not, maybe you want to suggest this, but do you create learning opportunities? Do you have a place where teams can just break out and work? Do you have opportunities for them to be able to just pull a whiteboard or a flip chart, or if they need a computer tool to make a value stream, do you have that? You want to have all those things available and kind of spur of the moment, because that's really what continuous improvement is. You're not going to know what problems are necessarily always going to come up. and you want to be able to apply that countermeasure, and you want to be able to learn and grow from that.
Well, you have to look at an organization as, you know, the continuous improvement part is a process, and you wouldn't tell somebody to go out and do a process on the assembly line without giving them the right tools and the right materials. But then we go and we expect them to do a continuous improvement process, and we don't give them the right tools or materials or spaces or equipment to work. So you want to be able to put those things in place, and then you can measure it. And again, you know, when you talk about the tools and equipment materials, if you run into a problem of having stockouts or tools taken, things like that, then you can start measuring it. But the big one here is, you know, check the block. Have you put these things in place? If you always have a problem as a Kaizen teams finding meeting rooms, you know, I've seen organizations that they have very limited number of rooms, and the Kaizen team is picking up and rotating twice a day, trying to piece together a place to work and operate as a base of operations for the whole week. And it's very disruptive to a team when you have all your stuff on the wall and you have to spend your limited, precious improvement time, you know, relocating. So what you want to do is create this infrastructure, and if you have a problem with it, measure it. If you don't have a problem, it's not probably worth spending the effort on it because, again, your continuous improvement time is precious. And it comes down to, go ahead.
Comes down to the training. You know, I think you know, Jeff's pretty humble here, but he has a number of resources available, and you know, I would definitely recommend that he take some time to look at that. You know, from articles to obviously his continuous improvement dictionary, kind of a glossary of all the concepts. But you know, there's a large video library now that's really convenient for training. Everybody in the company did the same process in various groups. So again, I would recommend you go out there and take a look at what's available.
Well, thanks for that. I'm actually not that humble about my stuff. I think it's pretty great. I just try to draw the line about promoting it too heavy during a webinar like this. So I'm glad you did that and I didn't have to, because it is always nice to have people toot your horn like that. Anyway,
well, I'll tell you, I use this stuff, so I mean, I would highly recommend people look at it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, and wrapping things up here, you know, in tracking your lean progress, like we talked about kind of the what to track, but the how, you know, you want to do regular audits and assessments as you're beginning your journey. And initially, I think it's a lot of it is check the block thing. Have you created a workspace? Have you identified the training materials you're going to use? Have you done, you know, do you have the right things in place? And then as you start getting your policy deployment and your KPIs in place, to be tracking those and countermeasuring, looking at the lean processes. So what do you think, Tim? Like, how would you go about measuring an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think the regular audit part is good, and you know, the assessment is what you need, because that's the check and the adjustment lever that you can pull, right? You know, maybe we don't spend enough time with coming up with a plan, and I think we talked a lot about that in the beginning of the presentation about, you know, setting a stake in the ground in the future where you want to be and navigating that path to get there. But you also need that tool that allows you to look at where you are on that journey and see if you're on the path still, or did you wander into the forest somewhere. So, you know, that's an important part of the puzzle, is to look at, you know, the do part sometimes is relatively easy. You know, we spend very little time. We spend too much time in that, when we should be focusing on the other parts of the Plan, Do, Check, Act. But I think we talked about a lot of those elements today, and you know, hopefully this gives you some insight as to things that you can look at in your organization. Every business is different. Every industry has their unique problems. We don't recommend that you copy and paste, you know, from somebody else, but that doesn't mean that you can't learn from people like us, from other companies, as well as other, you know, lean practitioners. So I think you want to create that continuous learning opportunity. Hopefully we provided some of that today.
Yeah, one other thing you mentioned about the PDCA cycle, you know, they actually nest within each other. So, you know, if you set up your whole big picture, you know, the policy deployment that we looked at very early on, the X matrix, that's really about the biggest PDCA cycle you have in an organization. You know, you set your plan and you track against it. but each of your little improvement objectives, the targets that the tactical targets that Tim mentioned, each of those is going to have its own set of PDCA cycles that cascade down. And you actually can get into many, many layers of, the do of one higher level PDCA cycle is buried, or, you have another PDCA cycle buried within that, and it goes on and on. So as you talk about measurement and progress and checking your progress, it's a continuous thing at all levels of the organization as you start thinking about PDCA. So the big thing, going back like Tim is saying over and over, focus on the PDCA cycle. Figure out what is it that you're not achieving if you set your big picture goals, and try to link the drivers to that, and you measure the drivers. So I'm not a big one of saying measure everything about lean, but I am a big one saying if the problem is that when you tell people to go do PDCA, nobody knows what PDCA is, the plan, do, check, act cycle, that identifies a problem, and then you're going to want to measure training. So the idea is measure what's broken until it's fixed, and then go on to measuring something else. So with that, any last words, Tim?
No, I think there is a lot of information out there to be available, so certainly take some time. We've only touched on a few things here because of the time that we have, but certainly there's much more available to learn from.
Okay, and then a little bit of follow-up information here. You'll be able to see this. We are going to post the PowerPoint presentation in case you want to slap a few of these slides up and talk to your team about it. Or, so the PowerPoint will be there, and we'll be posting the recording on YouTube. So just follow either one of our blogs, and we'll be getting the information out to you shortly. And any questions, you got some contact information here. Again, our websites, both of them have contact information, easy to find on it, so you can get in contact pretty easily. So any questions at this point about the presentation today, or just anything in general? We've got about 7 minutes left. Okay, we do have one here, and this is from Justin. It's, how do you deal with leaders that don't buy into lean transition and pencil whip audits, especially when they are seen by upper management as priceless asset to an operation? Why don't you go ahead and take that one, Tim? And then,
well, I think a lot of organizations suffer from rewarding firefighting, So if you have somebody who's really, well-versed in problem solving, then, maybe they're not well-versed in problem aversion, right? So, I think it's important to look at what kind of culture and type of management you want to put in place, but certainly many companies are set up for rewarding what I call the short-term sighted firefighter and not the fire prevention expert. So, and I think we need to change that. We need to go back and, revisit those individual situations and say, okay, this one got biased, but how are we going to make sure that this doesn't happen again? That gets into the whole PDCA that we talked about. But, sometimes the management team won't necessarily, every single person on it will buy in. And just like all layers in the organization, you got to look at, is that person got the right skill sets to help the business? And at some point, if they don't, you have to take a look at, is there another opportunity for them internally, or is this just a situation where we've got to part ways? Because, I think this is well documented in lean healthcare in particular, but the management style had to change drastically in the lean transformation. And I think that's true in most business transformations. The traditional manager, for a lack of a better term, may not be the right type of skill that's needed in the new lean transform company. So it's something to keep in mind. And we've kind of touched a little bit on that, how roles and responsibilities change. But that's something that also changes in the lean company.
Well, it is interesting that a lot of what you're talking about here is relationship stuff. And this is, you have an organization, and often, like Tim was saying, people have a perception of who they are or what's important. And when you go into a lean organization, sometimes that perception carries over, even though what they're doing doesn't match the lean culture. And you'll see this with the leaders who really thrive on the adrenaline rush of diving into a problem, and they start throwing processes out the window and setting people in different directions. And what really it comes down to is it's very hard to change an organization if top-level leaders aren't on board. But when I go back to things like policy deployment, if you can get your leaders convinced, the upper management convinced about how important policy deployment is, one of the ways to do it is if you're a lower-level manager is just start doing it yourself and post it visually so that people come up and see it. And when a top-level manager sees something working, even if it's at a lower level of the organization, they grab onto it. So if you can show gains within your organization, no matter what level it is, when a senior boss sees that, they're gonna grab onto it because they are so, they may not have a good finger on the pulse of what the middle layer of managers are doing, but they do see the results at the end. And if they see an organization is getting good results, they want to replicate that throughout. So I think that is really where the lean processes start taking those layers of problems, the pencil whips out, because you can pencil whip an audit, but you can't pencil whip results. And if you don't get the quality numbers, it doesn't matter if you're whipping an audit or not. There's some disconnect there. So you can show an audit that's getting everything you want, but if you don't get the results, the audit's purpose is gone. So hopefully that's kind of what you're asking. But I think, in summary, I talk a lot and then I come back and I figure out what I said. If you show some way of managing your organization at your level that gets good results, and eventually if you make it visual, when the senior managers see it and they start asking questions about how you got those results, it's going to start being required further on the organization. And that's probably the best way I've seen people start deal with the leaders that don't buy in at middle levels. If you have an executive that doesn't buy into it, you got a bigger problem than that. So hopefully that's not what we're talking about. Another question. Typically, how many days training per year per person is the benchmark for a good lean site? We sometimes get criticized for the amount of training needed and would appreciate some views. Tim, how many days of training do you guys typically do in your organization?
That's a good question. I think the level with which you're at in the business makes a difference as well. And maybe you benchmark certain people for certain types of career growth as well, so that may be different. But I've seen some pretty high percentages of companies, 20%, 2 or 3 weeks per, year. I mean, there's some significant numbers. And I think you can go online and kind of look at a number of research studies, out there. And the overall message is I think that all that time is always paid back. So I think the more you can really invest in the training, for me personally, I think the more benefit you're going to get. Because without the knowledge is the lever, and that's the rate at which you can change the speed that you make your improvements. So to me, I think the more training you do, the faster you go, and vice versa. So as for a number, I think, I would say probably we spend at this company maybe about 10% of the time in training.
Yeah, I would look at the training and improvement time as kind of rolled into one. So, improvement time is really an on-the-job type of learning. As you're going through improvement, I like to see people partnered up with somebody who's a mentor to them. So if you can get 2 people working together, one more senior, one more junior, and they work as a team, the whole idea of coaching, coaches learn a lot while they're coaching. So if you just want a hard number, I would say 10% is a pretty good number. And it'll vary, plus or minus 5% probably. But if you get up more than, 15 or 20% of your time invested in improvement and training, what you start getting is you get this fatigue in an organization where there's so much change that people can't settle down from it. If it's too little, you don't make any change and the organization stagnates. So I would start and try and hit a number, and whatever number you pick, just decide, once you start tracking it, Jeff, you can start looking at, are you making progress fast enough? If not, you might want to dial it up. If you're getting too tired as an organization, you're seeing quality problems, or you're seeing lead time issues because people are distracted, you dial it back. But the idea here is just start measuring it and tie it to your results. Next question. I'll let you take this one, Tim. I'll let you start with this one. how would you start involving, this is from Jack, how would you start involving the people on the floor? They have all had Lean 101 training, but they are caught up currently in their day-to-day duties to work on continuous improvement.
Yeah, I think this is where the Kaizen event comes in. You know, I would personally pick an area that you know will be successful, that you know needs improvement, and use that as a demonstration case, right? So you, and in this case, I would use the Kaizen, formal Kaizen kind of structure and say, can we build up enough inventory to shut down for 3 days? You know, maybe you don't take the full week, you do a 3-day Kaizen. You know, you have your plan, you go in there, you execute, you come out, and you have a readout. But I think in that you have to have management's full support and participation in that. You know, do they need to attend the whole Kaizen workshop? Maybe not, but they need to at least participate in the opening and the closing. You know, come in with lunch, you know, these kind of things. So I think picking that area, doing that will be successful. But, you know, if you don't allow them the time, it's never going to happen. You can't say, I need you to do your job and then figure out how to make this improvement. Lean is not additional. You know, I think that's where we miss a lot, especially in the management level, is we continue to run the old system and the new system side by side. It's a replacement. It's not additional work. We're looking at maximizing the value, which means eliminating the things that are non-value added. It doesn't mean let's do the non-value added stuff and let's add the thing that we think we should be doing all along. So that would be my recommendation of how to approach that.
Yeah, I have a term I call the continuous improvement wave, and I look at it like when you're surfing, it's much easier to surf on the front of the wave than the back of the wave. So once you get a little bit of extra capacity and you start riding that wave, you can make good progress. So what we're talking about a lot is you got to get that 10% flex. So, you know, you overstaff by 10% so that 10% can continue to make process improvement, and eventually what you'll find, there's an inflection point where that plus 10% gets you enough gains that down the road you'll have a much more productive organization even with the 10% built in. And the risk is always that people harvest those gains, and they harvest it for short-term benefits. So they'll take make a gain, you'll save a little bit of capacity, and you immediately change your headcount. And it's really the wrong thing to do, is to take those people out. But specifically about what you're talking about, Jack, is you want to create a pull for the project. So instead of going out and saying, hey, we want to do a lean project, we want to do a Kaizen, create a demand for the work. So ask the people on that team, what's the most frustrating part of your job? And you make a list of it, and you give them each 5 or 10 votes, and you kind of mark on this list, and eventually you'll find 4 or 5 of the most frustrating parts of a team's job. And you just do a small project to deal with that. And you repeat the process until you get people looking forward to that. So it doesn't have to be a full Kaizen, but what you want to do is you want to show the application of the tools in terms of something that's important to them, not what's important to the company. And eventually, you know, there's a correlation to things that frustrate people will eventually trickle up. So, you know, the frustrating things also tend to be problems with productivity or quality or things like that. But if you can start focusing on the things that are most important to them and they see the results, they become more receptive to the whole process. So hopefully that's a answer to the question you asked. Don has a question. Can you briefly discuss how and what to measure during basic lean transformation as different than eventual measurement of your progress against hitting targets in meeting the business results? And that's once lean's in place. So I think what he's saying is, what would you measure specifically during the transformation? I would measure, you know, percent of the team trained. I would measure some of the check the block things. Do you have a workspace created? Do you have a training room designated? Do you have the right training materials in place? I would set a target for the number of Kaizens. I would check the block on getting policy deployment. I would set a check the block type of measurement. You know, by this date we want to have a pilot daily management in place. So these are all the core things that you want to be able to build off of. One nice thing about early in the transformation, you can pilot a lot of things and focus on the people who have the most skills and the most responsiveness or most receptiveness to it. So some people want to go out and throw, you know, everything out everywhere all at once. Tim had mentioned piloting, so I think he's on board with my train of thought. a new organization can't handle the chaos of everything changing all at once. So I like to go in and kind of get a foothold, create one specific spot in the organization, so you can have some metrics to measure the rollout of certain tools in that pilot area. So those are the types of things I would look at. Tim?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. When I started the last company doing lean, you look at those basic engagement and training type metrics, the number of activities, the number of people participating on an event, number of people trained, the number of events, and you can migrate into things as you grow in a little bit more sophistication, maybe return on investment, how much you spend on Kaizen, you can look at how a number of value-added steps or a number of waste steps you've removed as a percentage. So I think there's some other metrics you can get into, but certainly in the beginning, it's more about the relationships and the training and the engagement.
I'd agree with that. That's a pretty good way of summarizing it. So with that said, I think we've got all of the questions answered. We've got all of our slides covered. So I think that wraps things up. So like I said, if you subscribe to one of our blogs or just check our websites periodically, you will see when we get this posted. I've gotten much better at getting them posted more quickly. So within the next couple of days, you should see it up and you should see a notice from us. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.